Well, Toby Hudson is currently writing a doctoral thesis at the University of Oxford on the subject of the sound of the Indo-European word accent. His work forms part of the Ancient Sounds Project in Oxford, and today he'll be presenting a paper entitled Using Acoustic Simulations to Model Stress Shift in Latin. Over to you, Toby.
Thank you. And I'm sorry for introducing so much excitement on the technical front. So ideally, you're going to hear, well, you can obviously hear me speak. There's going to be some sound files embedded in that, and maybe people on the web will hear everything as well. Yes, this is an aspect of my ongoing doctoral work, but it does plug into a wider research project that we have going on in the phonetics lab to do with ancient sounds and sort of reconstructing the just how they sounded. So for an occasion like this, it's an opportunity for me to share a new sort of methodology for investigating sound change in general and prosodic change in particular, with my Latin case study. And I'll be introducing particular speech morphing techniques, which simulate audio continua of changing pronunciations over a period of time. And it's my study rests very much on a perception experiment, but the files that I needed to run that perception experiment were synthesized using this technique. So this is a now frequent disclaimer. It's not really AI or Aleph or Alpha, but it does rely on modern speech synthesis. I think we can say that's a kind of AI, perhaps. It's using Mel frequency Kepsler coefficients to generate really natural sounding. I hope you will agree when you hear, if you hear the samples, that's as natural sounding as a real recording. And when it comes to the perception experiment, well, that's kind of traditional phonetics, but it's using a sort of quantitative or computational approach to handling sound change rather than just a sort of textual representation of what happened. So just a few words about the background, about word stress. So in Indo-European, words are typically relatively short, especially compared to some language families in the world. And there seems to be some governing principles which hold fairly well. One is the principle of culminativity. So this is the restriction to maximally one primary stress in the word, and obligatoriness. That's to say that there should be one stress and not none. So ideally, in a well-formed, prosodically well-formed word, you have a single peak prominence in some parameter or other. However, as you will be aware, there are secondary stresses in the word. It's a more complex picture, but these are governing principles that seem to hold quite well. The accentuation of Proto-Indo-European, which is reconstructed largely on the basis of the oldest Greek and Sanskrit records, was a more unpredictable kind of a stress system, morphologically, lexically determined. So the stress position in the word would have been stored in the mental lexicon. There were predictable elements to it, but we would largely call it an unpredictable system. However, the Indo-European languages in the West over time lost that way of accenting words and instead transitioned to a system of fixed stress. So particularly at the start of the word, to very much in the manner of the neighboring languages at the time. So probably dealing with an aerial feature here, and with stress that was syllabically anchored to one end of the word. And Italic was no exception to this. In the oldest languages, Indo-European languages of Italy, we find a feature very widespread throughout the area, which is that syllables were weakened with a sort of raising of vowels, and in some cases lost altogether, but never the first syllable. The first syllable never went, which is highly indicative of stress on the first syllable. and this kind of stress-related effect of syllable weakening, syllable loss later in the word. So, for instance, the Oscan word hurts for garden, which relates to Latin hortus. You can see that in that nominative form, there's been a syncopation and a loss of a whole syllable. And again, the surrounding environment was to syncopate. So the unrelated Etruscan language has different ways of writing the word, the name aulus, including sort of avle with two syllables, rather than avile, which it also has in variation. So turning to Latin, there's a whole host of words which have one syllable less than we would expect. So the word for 15, which is made up of quinque and decem, has lost its second syllable. Quindecim is Latin for 15. The word for cheap is princeps, which would have come from reconstructed small caps. We've lost the penultimate syllable. And even borrowed words, so from Greek balaneon, the word for bath, we've lost the second syllable. So the Greek has got that stress late on in the word, accent late in the word. Latin has applied its word initial stress system and lost a whole syllable. This same process continues to the present day. So a word in Italian like donna for woman has come from domina with 3 syllables in Latin. And there doesn't seem to be any clear-cut sort of metrical motivation for how this works. The classical language, the accentuation of classical Latin is very familiar to us. It's at the right edge of the word, the other end of the word, and it's restricted to the final 3 syllables. More than that, it never, with a few exceptions, it never falls in the final syllable. And the famous rule for where to put your accent is this rule of penultimate, and it depends on the internal makeup of the antepenultimate and penultimate syllables. So if the penultimate syllable has got a heavy weight, so that's a long vowel or closed with a consonant, then it will attract the stress. Otherwise, it will default to antepenultimate position. So for instance, rapiditas, we ignore that extra metrical final syllable and we put the stress on the antepenult. And this principle of accentuation is well known to us because of all the Romance languages that we know today. Even if there's been further syllable loss, very often the same morpheme will retain the stress. So for instance, in a word like hospitalem, the penultimate syllable has attracted the stress. That stress has then become associated with that morpheme to the point where in Spanish hostal, the stress has retained its morphemic position. So it's a window on the past in that respect. Also, we have witnesses from the time. For instance, Cicero, I've given you an example here, telling us that nature herself has ordained that stress should be at the right end of the word and within a 3-syllable window. So, window break. So why did this happen? Why did the stress shift from the left edge to the right edge of the word? Well, the shifting about of stress is not unfamiliar to those of us who speak English, which is all of us in the room. For instance, where we have 2 consecutive stresses coming together, we often cast the stress back 1 syllable. So 13 would become 13, a trochee before a stress syllable. So we would tend to say 13 men rather than 13 men. In Latin, it's possible and really among metrical phonologists considered very likely that there was a re-parsing of the words such that under the sort of underlying parsing of the word, whereby the main stress was assigned to the right rather than the left when you've got 2 or more feet. So in a word like genitive incudis, we've got a heavy, and then a light syllable. The default accent would have been left on the left foot in Old Latin, on the right foot the u in classical Latin. That change of parsing would have left most 3-syllable words intact with the same accentuation. So we can imagine how a change happened that then had this knock-on effect for some words. And Latin words are typically pretty short. Another possibility is that pre-stressing enclitics are to blame. So, for instance, the que suffix enclitic meaning and brought the stress into position just immediately before it. So, in a word like ita, we would get itaque, or virum would be verumque. And that when you get something like that happening, it's going to be kind of triggering to speakers, to a new generation of speakers, where they think, oh, well, I do it on these words, maybe I should be doing it in a more widespread way. And this same process seems to be happening in a particular variety of Dakota. So I think there's a sort of typological point to be made there. Another possibility is that since Latin gained a long vowel system, speakers would have been sort of aware that there was a disparity in the duration of their syllables. So whilst they had a stress on the first syllable, they would also have had very divergent lengths of the following syllables in the word. Something quite similar perhaps in the Czech language today, which is said to have a left edge stress, but it's got these length disparities later in the word because of the long vowel system. It could be some other reason, it could be a combination of the above. But what I'm interested in is how we actually get from A to B, and whether there could be a sort of phonetic basis to the change. And this is because in the 1980s, the late John O'Hala really made an impact on this field by suggesting that sound change emerges from a pool of variation. And by that, I mean that rather than thinking about a sound change being from form A to form B, we could think of it in this variationist way of forms A and B coexisting all along, but in differing weightings. So to start with, form A is dominant, and at the end, form B is dominant. So we could then think about our polysyllabic words as being kind of fluctuating planes of competing prominences, which are playing with the listener's perception. And so I'm thinking, can I model a change such as farcire to farcire on perceptual grounds alone? To do that, well, we can't go back in time, so we need a proxy or some sort of proxy data to work with. And all things being equal, a daughter language would be ideal, so why not work with Italian? But far more important to me is that Italian happens to have near minimal prosodic minimal pairs. So, for instance, words which basically differ only in their accentuation. So ancora means an anchor, ancora means still or yet. And there's a good number of words like this that we could employ as proxies for early stress, late stress. And of course, there are Italian speakers, and we can ask them to tell me which word they can hear. So I could play them a sound file. They can tell me, are they hearing the word for an anchor or the word for still? But obviously, we don't just simply want a binary with those. We want a whole continuum form. What about that intervening space between ancora and ancora? And the reason why it's worth even considering a perception experiment like this is because of the principle of categorical perception. We simply don't go around dithering about what we're hearing. We make a gut response, and our percepts fall into categories. So, for instance, this is a real traditional categorical perception experiment for something like voice onset time. So, a continuum between perp and bur in English, and at some point, your perception of one form gives way to perception of the other form. Sure, there'll be an area where you're not sure if it's a per or a bur, but there is a point where it's all switching over. So, as I said, we've got a good number of words we could use in Italian. So I've taken two pairs of words which relate to stress moving from the first syllable to the second, such as levati, levati. And then two pairs that relate to medial stress moving to final stress, such as arrivo and arrivo. And then two pairs that relate to initial stress changing to final stress, such as auguro and auguro. I got recordings from one speaker, gave me a good set of recordings. They're the input for my perceptual experiment. It seems that my sound isn't coming through. In the interest of time, I'll press benchmark. Right. I remember this. Is it?
Yeah.
So
Okay, sorry. Okay. Now I think people can hear from home. We just played a short recording of people saying passero and passero, changing from one to the other. Apologies if you couldn't hear it at home.
great, and so
But I say that, and I'm Italian, so that's what.
I should just have done you
Yeah.
continua. So for everyone who did hear the continua, what you first of all heard was an interpolation between the original recordings, and the second I removed the pitch variation, so it was a monotone version of that. Now, to make these continua, you can't just sort of squish audio files together. You have to vocode the signal. Okay, so there's a particular way I did that using the AHO coder. It's freely available. Everyone can try doing that. And then you just decide how many intervening steps you want. So I went for 9. Don't ask me why. I think you might have heard in some of those steps, you might have heard the difference. Some you might not. So I feel that I was playing around the minimal difference threshold without it descending into too many forms. So and then convert it back into audio files, and that gives us the continua. Now this technique is we've been using it in different ways in ancient sounds. So to do it, you need 2 audio files. They need to be more or less time aligned. If they're not, you can squish them, you can stretch them. In this case, they aligned pretty well. Once you've got that good clean audio, you use that as an input to the synthesis. And so, for instance, this is the slide we always show on this subject. a sound morphing from something in Latin into modern day Portuguese. It could equally well be morphing from Old Latin into Classical Latin. And the point about this is that every interpolation is a reweighting of the contribution of the vocoded signal from the early and the late audio file. So we've been using it for different things. My supervisor, John, has been looking at the afterlife of the reconstructed laryngeal consonants from Indo-European, how they turn into vowels later on in Greek. I won't play the audio given that will come through. Jonathan Way is currently doing a very similar thing, creating stimuli to use in perception experiments, looking at the breaking of monophthongal vowels in Old English. So by doing this kind of experiment, we are forced to be explicit about the sound change rather than just hand waving, writing a symbol and saying, well, it's something like this. So we're actually working with the acoustics. So my results are from a small pilot study, just 9 listeners, different regions of Italy represented. Because of the pandemic at the time, I was forced to go online. Turned out that was a pretty good way of doing it on the web platform. I used Testable, freely available, and when I scale this up, I will continue to do it online. So we've got the 6 pairs of words that I showed you earlier, 9 intervening steps for each one, so that's 11 times 6 word pairs, times 4 conditions. So I've got the original, I've got the monotone, which I played to you. I also made an isochronous version where the durational disparities were ironed out, and also did a low pass filter, so it's just a non-finite risk at the moment here, the prosody. This is what listeners saw. They had to simply, they were listening, headphones, they had to click on the word that they heard, and also to give a score about how confident they were about each judgment. I haven't analyzed the confidence scores yet. So here's the data, and you saw earlier that model categorical perception experiment. We expect to see a sharp drop if there's been categorical perception. Well, it's a bit messy in the low pass, so I'm just going to leave that out for now. There are reasons for that, but the others show the right kind of shape, and I'm just now overlaying them all onto each other. So the blue line is the original audio, the other 2 have been manipulated, but all 3 show that steep drop in the curve, indicating the possibility of a categorical boundary. To really probe this, I would need to get pairwise discrimination data. But what I used to begin with was, in each case, putting all the data in order, the first instance within the continuum where the listeners were taking the late stress, the second word, to be what they heard. That's sort of the first point where they think they're hearing the late stress. That's what I'm calling the flipping point. So what's the flipping point? It's somewhere around the middle of the word, around the 7th interpolation. And that kind of leptokurtic shape is indicative of quite a steep change. The manipulated audio, it's much more of a spread out change. But when all the parameters are in the mix, we get a pretty neat drop. I'm not making any statement about what the Latin accent sounded like. Was it primarily cued by pitch? Was it primarily durational? I have thoughts about it, but not any time to really talk about that now. Broadly speaking, there are 2 schools of thought in the scholarship, divided between a sort of pitch accent people and stress accent people. I think it's a false dichotomy to begin with. So in conclusion, the pitch and the timing were seen to be salient cues towards stress, even when I unpicked the different conditions, and that slight variation we just saw does point to an additive role of the cues. More importantly, though, this hypothesis that prominence may emerge from a pool of prosodic variation and pattern categorically has been supported. So if you believe that this is a reasonable proxy for what happened in Latin and other languages that underwent this, then we've got some sort of phonetic basis for thinking about how it might have happened. And we don't need recourse to any additional explanatory factors. That's not to say that any of the other stuff was wrong. It's just that it speaks for itself. But it doesn't tell us about the shifting of stress from one metrically weak syllable onto another. So something like facilius to facilius. So you have to think about analogy. You've got to come up with a broader story to explain that. I'm going to repeat the experiment with a larger number of listeners, of course, get some proper pairwise discrimination judgments and examine the confidence scores. So I like to think that by exploring sound change, prosodic change in this way, we're getting a bit closer to the reality and not just working with sort of symbolic representations. I hope I've sold the method to you. You can see what we've been doing in ancient sounds. You can hear all of John's reconstructions for PIE and so on. If you go to the URL here, you can follow us on Twitter. This is the three of us currently involved with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toby. That was a great talk. In the interest of keeping more or less on track time-wise, we might have only one question. Then we'll have a very brief bathroom break, reconvene here at 12:10. But if you have questions for Toby beyond one that gets to be asked now, ask him during the bathroom break or for lunch. So, the floor is open for questions.
You hinted at a difficult point, but how do you think the debate between stress versus pitch in Latin is on this?
Well, how does this touch on the debate?
Yeah.
So nowadays, I would say there's a gulf between what phonologists believe and what's in the philological literature about this. In fact, now the philological literature is aligning with what is more broadly believed. So the real problem with thinking of pitch accent and stress accent as being two options is that we're not really comparing like with like. So pitch is a phenomenon. It's the percept that relates to the speed of vibration of the vocal folds. Stress is not a percept or an acoustic parameter. It's an idea. We could ask a native speaker of a language, where's the stress? They might be able to tap it. They might be able to tell us, they might not. It relates to whatever parameters produce that feeling that the speaker has. However, a more prototypical stress language, stress-timed language with syllables very disparate in length, will be using duration of a syllable as a cue to stress. But you can never escape intonation. So there will almost certainly be some aspect of pitch involved. There may be other things involved as well. British English is a very stress-timed language. What's the primary correlate of stress in English? Probably simply the disparity of the phonemic inventory that you get on stressed syllables and the reduced inventory on unstressed syllables. Yeah. So these things are all in the mix. So in a nutshell, I would say the problem with thinking of a dichotomy like that is you're not comparing like with like, but it's a useful fiction. There's something in it. Yeah, I hope that answers it in some way.
Excellent. So thank you again very much, Toby. We'll reconvene. Yeah, please.